Story 1: The Whispering Walls. When Mark and Emily finally moved into their dream home, it seemed too good to be true. It was a charming old house in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for their growing family. The house was over 100 years old, with creaky wooden floors, tall ceilings, and large windows that filled the rooms with sunlight. Despite its age, the house felt solid, and they loved its character. From the first night, however, things began to feel off. Mark dismissed the unsettling sensation, attributing it to the stress of moving. Emily, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the silence of the night, the house felt alive. There were faint creaks and groans, but it was the voices, soft, whispering voices, that truly unnerved her. She would hear them mostly at night, just as she was drifting off to sleep. Faint murmurs, as though people were speaking in hushed tones just outside her door. She mentioned it to Mark, but he shrugged it off. "It's an old house, Em. Old houses make noise." But the whispers grew more persistent. Soon, Emily began to notice that the voices seemed to be following her. It wasn't always at night anymore. Sometimes when she was alone in the house, she would hear them in the walls, faint conversations she couldn't quite make out. She tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, angrier. One evening, as Emily was putting their 2-year-old son to bed, he suddenly stopped and looked at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, who's the man?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What man, sweetheart?" He pointed to the far corner of the room. "The man in the wall." Chills ran down her spine. There was no one there. She held her son closer, trying to comfort him, but he kept insisting he could see the man. That night, the whispers seemed louder than ever, almost as if they were angry that Emily knew they were there. The next day, Emily decided to do some research on the house's history. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find. Maybe a simple explanation, something that could ease her growing unease. What she found instead horrified her. The house had been the site of a brutal murder nearly 50 years ago. A man had gone mad and killed his entire family, hiding their bodies within the walls before taking his own life. That night, Emily confronted Mark. "We have to leave this house," she said. "It's not safe." But Mark wasn't convinced. He thought Emily was letting her imagination run wild. They argued, and Emily finally went to bed frustrated and scared. In the dead of night, Emily was awoken by a loud crash. She sat up, heart pounding, and immediately noticed that Mark was gone. Panic set in as she ran through the house, calling his name. She found him in the basement, standing in front of a section of the wall, staring blankly ahead. "Mark!" she screamed, shaking him. He turned to her, eyes wide and filled with fear. I heard them. They told me to open the wall." Emily looked at the wall and saw a crack, as if someone had been trying to break through it. Horrified, she dragged Mark upstairs, refusing to let him go back down. The next morning, they packed their things and left the house for good. They never returned, but the memory of the whispering walls and whatever was hidden behind them haunted them for years. Story 2: The Shadow in the Hallway. Lauren and James were thrilled when they moved into their new home, a modern house in a newly developed neighborhood. Everything was pristine, from the fresh paint to the polished floors. They spent their first few weeks settling in, enjoying the quiet and the clean, open space, but it wasn't long before Lauren started to feel like something was wrong. It was subtle at first, just a sense that she wasn't alone when she was walking down the hallway. She felt like something was always just behind her, a presence lurking in the shadows. She didn't mention it to James, thinking it was just nerves from the stress of the move, but the feeling persisted. Whenever she walked down the hall to their bedroom, she would feel it, a cold, creeping sensation that sent shivers down her spine. One night, as she passed the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of something dark out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Terrified, she turned around, but there was nothing there. Her heart raced as she told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. A few nights later, James finally saw it too. He was coming out of the bathroom when he froze. There at the end of the hallway stood a tall, dark figure. It had no face, no features, just a solid, menacing shadow. "Lauren," he whispered, voice shaking. "Come here." When she came to see what he was staring at, the figure was gone. They tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," James said, though he didn't sound convinced. But from that night on, the shadow appeared more often. It would stand at the end of the hallway, watching them. Sometimes it moved, disappearing into the walls or fading into the darkness. One night, after seeing the shadow again, they decided to set up a camera in the hallway to catch whatever it was. They left it running overnight, too scared to check it until morning. When they finally reviewed the footage, their blood ran cold. The camera showed the shadow, tall, dark, and menacing, standing at the end of the hallway for hours, just watching. Then, without warning, it slowly began to move toward the camera. As it got closer, the footage cut to static. They moved out of the house the next day. They never found out what the shadow was, but they knew one thing for sure: it wasn't human. Story 3. The Crying Baby. Sarah and Tom had just bought their first house, a beautiful 2-story home in the suburbs. It was everything they had dreamed of, a place where they could start their family. It wasn't long after moving in that they discovered Sarah was pregnant, and the house felt even more perfect, a new beginning for their growing family. A few weeks later, they started hearing strange noises at night. It was faint at first, a distant sound that they could barely hear. But over time, it grew louder, crying, as though a baby was somewhere in the house. At first, they thought it was just the stress of the pregnancy playing tricks on them. But soon, the crying became impossible to ignore. Every night, just after midnight, the crying would start. It sounded as if it was coming from the walls, or sometimes from the empty nursery they had just begun to set up. The first time Tom went to check, he found nothing. No baby, no source of the noise. But the crying continued, night after night, growing more and more desperate. Sarah began to have vivid nightmares. In her dreams, she would see a woman, pale and gaunt, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing over a crib, crying hysterically. The woman would scream at her, "Where is my baby?" One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of the crying, louder than ever before. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw the woman from her dreams standing at the foot of her bed. The woman's face was twisted in anguish, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah screamed, waking Tom, but by the time he turned on the light, the woman was gone. Terrified, they called a local paranormal investigator, who came to the house the next day. After a long investigation, he revealed that a tragedy had occurred in the house many years before. A woman had lost her baby shortly after childbirth, and in her grief she had taken her own life. Ever since, the sound of her cries, and the cries of the baby, had haunted the house. Unable to handle the constant terror, Sarah and Tom decided to move out before their own baby was born. They never heard the crying again, but Sarah would sometimes dream of the woman, standing over the crib, still searching for her lost child.